Hello, my name is Fisher Derderian, and I am the Executive Director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. Thank you all for joining us today, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to The Future of Building Beautiful, an interview with the Rt Hon Robert Jenrick. For those of you joining us for the first time today, the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation was founded last year to support and further the works and writings of the great British philosopher Sir Roger Scruton. Our aim is to establish Scruton's legacy through the conservation, care, and continuation of humane wisdom and culture from the Western tradition. As some of you will know, architecture was an area of great importance, a topic of great importance to Sir Roger. He spent the last year of his life working on a commission for the UK government, Building Better, Building Beautiful, which is where this series gets its name from. And I think it's fitting that we actually started this series with Sir Roger's co-chair of the commission, Nicholas Boy-Smith, and are now ending it with the individual who oversaw the publication of its report, Living with Beauty, and has been working to implement some of its proposals. But I'll leave it there for our interview, or for the host of this interview series, Dr. Samuel Hughes. Samuel is the Foundation's Senior Fellow in the Built Environment. He is also a Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange and a Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. I think Samuel has done a wonderful job in picking up the torch where Roger left it in the topics of urbanism and architecture, and has been doing a fantastic job in guiding the series as an able and wise host. So Samuel, I turn it over for you for a great conversation. Thank you.
Many thanks as ever, Fisher. It's my great pleasure today to introduce the Right Honourable Robert Jenrick, MP for Newark and Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. In 2020, Robert oversaw the publication of Living with Beauty, the report of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission that Sir Roger Scruton and Nicholas Boy-Smith had co-chaired. Earlier this year, as Fisher mentioned, his department published a comprehensive response, which I think largely accepted the recommendations of the Commission's report. Jenrick has consistently championed the Building Beautiful programme since becoming Secretary of State, publishing the first National Model Design Code to show how communities can demand beautiful places locally, and working to establish a new Office of Place, which will support communities in doing this. Robert, it's our honour and our pleasure to host you on the series. And before we go on, Fisher, I always forget to do this, and Fisher then reproaches me halfway through the conversations. I should urge the audience to post questions as we talk in the Q&A bar, which I'll then come to in the Q&A session at the end. Robert, we usually start these conversations, and usually with architects and urban designers, and we talk about how they came to be interested in the idea of Building Beautiful, the Beautiful program. Now, in a way, that's going to be an obvious answer for you, as you were made Secretary of State halfway through the term of the Building Beautiful Commission. But I think it's fair to say that you've, since then, you've very much made the issue your own, and you've been a kind of major champion of it. So I suppose I wanted to ask, do you have a more long-standing personal interest in this issue? And if you do, how did it come about?
Well, thanks, Samuel. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And to be a part in a small way of Sir Roger Scruton's Legacy Foundation and the work that you're taking forwards. It's fitting in a sense to be in this slightly nondescript modern office, but it was just behind me the last time that I saw Roger Scruton, who came in to see me when he was most unwell, weeks before his death, to give me the final update on his report. And in his characteristic way, he set it out brilliantly, inspired those of us who were present. And I hope that we are, if he were looking down on us, he would feel that we were taking forward that work in the spirit in which he began it. But you're right to say that I didn't come to this entirely fresh when I was appointed as Secretary of State. It is something that I've been interested in really my whole life. I don't think there are many young people who spent their pocket money on Pevsner's guides and
Right.
their parents to take them to National Trust properties rather than being wheeled around them by their parents. But I've been interested in architecture and place for a very long time, for as long as I can remember. And it was something that I was interested in my professional life before I became a member of parliament. And perhaps unusually for politicians these days, I worked in the arts and in culture before being elected, working at Christie's, the auction house, where actually my specialism was in houses, house sales, and decorative art.
I didn't know that. Right.
So I've got a very long-standing interest in this, and did a number of campaigns actually before I became a minister here in the UK on issues like saving Wentworth Woodhouse, one of the great stately homes of England, where I managed to persuade the then Chancellor Philip Hammond to invest in it, which was not an easy thing to do. And also when I was first elected, looking at cultural heritage around the world. And of course, that was the period when we had ISIS doing really devastating cultural vandalism at Palmyra and other places, and persuaded the then Prime Minister David Cameron to do the Cultural Heritage Bill, which went through Parliament and committed the UK to higher standards in protecting cultural heritage around the world as well as at home. So it's been a long-standing interest of mine, and I'm very pleased to be able now in this role to take it forward as Secretary of State.
We have mentioned that you've basically come out in favour of you supported the Building Beautiful Commission while it was operating, and you've since then broadly come out in favour of its recommendations. Now, I think there'll be a lot of interest among our audience in what the report contained and what the government's going to be doing about it. Now, there are 45 recommendations, and many of them have numerous technical subclauses. So I fear we're not going to be able to go into them in great technical detail. But I think, it seems to me that the thrust of the report was the need for local communities to determine what development near them looks like, and to be able to, demand beauty in development near them. That's having worked on it myself, that's my one sentence summary. Do you think that's on the right lines? And more generally, what are the key steps that the government's going to be taking towards implementing these recommendations?
Yes, I think that's a good description. I mean, the simplest way, I think, to describe what we're now trying to achieve is that the buildings that are created, the built environment that's established in the years ahead, should actually be popular, should be locally popular, should be the things that people who live in those communities actually admire and respect and want to see built around them. And in doing that, we build greater popular support for new housing, for new development, and for better communities. And that the built environment shouldn't be something that is imposed upon local communities. It shouldn't just be something that is the dream of an architect or what is fashionable to a certain type of person. And if we can do that, then I think we will make a significant step forward. So we're trying to take this forward in a number of different ways. I mean, the simplest, but I think in some respects the most profound thing we've done is to embed the concept of beauty and design into the planning system. And these are words which are curiously absent from all of the long line of planning bills that have been passed through Parliament since the Second World War. The word beauty, I don't think, appeared once since 1945, and it will do now in the National Planning Policy Framework, and it will do in the planning bill that we want to take forward in the future. And that is a simple but important step forward. And actually, it was interesting the other day that I was driving past a housing development by a national house builder here in England, and I noticed that on their board, their sort of promotional board by the site, they now use the word beauty. They said, whatever it was, 40 beautiful homes. And I wonder whether they would have done that just a few years ago, when that word seemed to be something that was almost archaic or eccentric, which of course it wouldn't have been to previous generations. We want to now embed that as something that is a fundamental part of the planning system. In a more practical sense, what we're setting out to do is set off local communities to produce locally popular design guides and codes in which they have a very strong say in what they care about, what design, what local vernacular, what local identity and heritage they want to see reflected in housing and buildings that go forward, what other things they might care about, from the natural environment, tree-lined streets or access to parks, open spaces, to perhaps even simpler, more prosaic things like the parking arrangements or playgrounds and other things that you want to see in local housing and communities. And then for that to have some binding effect in the planning system, and so that a local community can demand that new development that comes forward is built, broadly speaking, in accordance with that. And the other side of the equation is that if you're a developer or a builder, you know what the rules are, you have a good sense of what is popular in that community, and if you abide by that, then actually you'll find that the planning system is somewhat easier and faster and more certain to you. And so there could be a happy marriage between the two. Good quality development comes forward, and for the developers and the builders and so on, there's greater certainty and ease when they're finding their way through the planning process. And we're now going to be using the design codes and guides that we've produced as models to pilot those in different parts of the country, to test whether they work and how easily we can help other communities to replicate them. Of course, there are already some good examples across the UK, from whole counties, like parts of the country, like the Cotswolds, who have their own design code, to particular sites. Of course, prominent ones like the Duchy of Cornwall sites are particularly well known, but there are others. We want to see that piloted in more parts of the country, with a view to it then becoming legally mandatory that every community, every local authority should set out to do this exercise, so that one day in the not too distant future, we would have the patchwork across the whole of the country where everywhere have the benefit of good quality, locally popular design guides and codes, and use that as a tool to drive up standards and drive up the quality of housing that's being built.
You know, there's a lot of themes that I could pick up there, but I think the one thing that's come up repeatedly, well, one of the themes that's come up repeatedly on this series, people have been intrigued. They were intrigued just by the talk about beauty, and the theme that's come up, people say, is sure, just putting the word beauty into the planning system won't be enough by itself, but it does help, because most lay people have things to say about beauty. They know what they think about this. They feel they've got a view, this is beautiful, this is ugly. Whereas if you use the more obscure bureaucratic language, you know, design excellence, or succeeding against various vectors of performance, or these kinds of, people think, oh, that's not for me, obviously I'm not qualified to talk about this. So it's interesting how much that reframing has helped by itself, I think, and it probably, as you say, is probably helping already.
I think that's right. And you know, if we were sat here 100 years ago, or even slightly less long ago than that, before the Second World War, it wouldn't have been unusual for people to be judging a new building, a new community, a work of art, all sorts of things on the grounds of whether it was beautiful. It then became extremely unfashionable to say that, and you would judge it with, is it innovative, is it modern, other terms of phrase. And it's not to diminish those, but the most fundamental thing in our lives really is, what is our emotional reaction to something? Do we love it? Do we feel comfortable with it? Does it excite us? Is it beautiful? And I think it's really important for us to connect or reconnect the planning system to that basic human instinct. And if we can do that, then, as I say, there's all sorts of benefits, not just in us all living in more beautiful places, but also building more popular support for new housing and development. And I've always had a view that development can actually enhance a place. And there's lots of examples where development has actually made somewhere better. But that is too rare. And part of the reason for that is that we don't build things that are high enough quality. We don't build things that are beautiful. And we don't listen to local people's view as to what they really want to see. I certainly have strong views on what I like and consider beautiful, but I don't think it's so difficult actually to come to a view, broadly speaking, on what people in a particular place want to see. And it's been a bit of a false argument to say that all of us disagree on this.
Incorrigibly subjective.
It's horribly subjective. Therefore, we should neglect and negate the views of the general public and just go on what a small group of people who are professionals or architects or planners see as
supposedly have objective views rather than subjective views on these questions.
Exactly.
I wanted to this is related to the Building a Beautiful Commission, but it's slightly broader. And one of the background things in planning reform in Britain over a slightly longer period of this government has been the emphasis on localism, and the introduction of neighbourhood planning. So I think our audience is about half international. So neighbourhood planning is a system whereby parishes, which are very small communities, or sort of urban neighbourhoods, can effectively write their own planning policy, and then they hold a referendum on it, and if it passes, that becomes part of the planning policy that guides decisions in the area, just with equal status to those of the planning policies of more established government bodies. That's been around in some form for about 10 years now, and slowly kind of gaining steam, and now maybe quite a few neighbourhood plans in parts of the country and other areas where there's been less uptake. Do you think neighbourhood planning, has it basically been a success? And if so, do you think there are ways in which it could be taken further or improved further?
I think broadly speaking, it has been a success. It's something that I strongly support. It is something we've seen. I think there's about 2,700 groups who have started the process since 2012, and there's been about 1,000 successful neighbourhood plans created or referendums held since then. The difficulties people have encountered, I think, are that it can be quite a slow process, that it requires a huge amount of energy and effort and people within that community willing to put that time in. That can sometimes select the types of places where you see them, where you have that type of person, retired people with certain skills and so on. So it is not a clear picture across the whole of the country. And there is some frustration that, having devoted a lot of time to it, sometimes several years, then is it given the standing in the planning system that it really deserves? And so what I would like to see is there be more successful neighbourhood plans across the country, that the process be faster and simpler and more engaging, that we're able to deliver these in all parts of the country, not just in parts of the country where there are particular types of people who've got the time and the energy to do this. And then once it is created, it actually has some teeth. And so people feel that this was a rewarding thing to have done. And then the last thing I'd say is, going back to our previous conversation, is that we want to ensure that there is a strong design element to these. And so you really think through not just which sites do you allocate to build houses on. So we choose in the village which field we want to build on and which we definitely don't want to build on, or how we want to protect certain things. But what do we want these properties to actually look like? And that is happening to date, but I think there's more that we can do there. And that's part of the Scrutin legacy, where we can use the planning system, we can use design codes and guides to help communities to say, well, what makes this village special, amongst other things, is the particular architectural heritage that we have. Or if we do have to build homes because we want to help the next generation onto the housing ladder, let's make them look like this, so that they actually enhance and improve and build upon the heritage of this community, rather than detract from it or see properties which Roger Scruton might have described as anywheresville properties dumped to this place. And so I think there's I would like to see more, but also a particular emphasis on design in the next generation of neighbourhood plans.
Some of them have very good design codes, but it's surprising how often they haven't been included so far. I've been quite puzzled by that, but it's, I think sometimes the burden of drawing them up has been very great, or there's...
I think that's right. And one of the tasks of the new Office for Place that we're creating, which Nicholas Boys-Smith, who was the co-chair of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, is helping us to establish, will be to provide the tools for anywhere from the most sophisticated local authority, a city council, say, to set out and do this task, to a smaller neighbourhood, how can you help people to come up with something that is useful, that's not so restrictive that it essentially is impossible to build anything in that community, or the cost is so high that the properties are not affordable to people who really need to get on the ladder. If we can provide the tools to them, then we may see more of these happening in other parts of the country.
So one part of this, the broad emphasis here is moving the democracy forward to ensure that designs future neighborhoods and provably popular places. I think another example of this has been your interest in street level design codes, both in the white paper and in your response to the Building Beautiful Commission, and my personal gratitude in your support for a paper that I co-wrote on this in a policy exchange recently. Was it the power for residents to set their own codes to ensure popular design that attracts you to this kind of policy?
Yes, very much so. My philosophy has been that we've got to put more hands, more cards into the hands of the local community to decide what they really want to see built in their local area. And if we can help them to create their own design code or guide, then that will make a big difference. And we can do that at a number of different levels. What I don't want to see are uninspired, sort of insipid municipal design codes and guides created by consultants. I don't think that takes us very much further. And in fact, we may not have achieved very much at all. It may just cost a lot of money and not genuinely improve the quality and the popularity of design. So you've got to try to engage local people and bring it down to the lowest sensible level. If we can do that at neighborhood level, could even do it at a street level, then I think that would be a huge step forwards.
Yeah, after all, a code is only as good as its contents. And if it's not written by people with that deep commitment to the street they live on or the neighborhood they live in, the guarantee is much weaker that it will have that.
I think that's right. I mean, there's definitely a balance to be struck, because some of the communities
expertise
are most admired, like some of the Duchy of Cornwall estates, for example, have extremely complex design codes and guides at their heart, and that has helped to achieve the look and the feel of those communities. And the model design code that we've produced in some respects speaks to that, because it is quite a long document. But we also want to have something which, were you a layperson and you were sat in your village, you are on the parish council, you could take that and say, well, we may not be able to produce something as elaborate as Poundbury or Nan Sledden has produced, but here are the half a dozen or dozen things that we do care about in this community. We love the Nottinghamshire red brick and tiles. We want to see our streets lined with trees. We want to see this particular facade, or whatever it happens to be. And it might not be that it's traditional vernacular like that. It might be a fact that they want to embrace something entirely different. But what can we offer that gives simple rules that then we expect to be abided by? And then you have to have the other side of the bargain, that if someone comes forward and abides by that, then they have some kind of, what we've always described it as, a fast track for beauty, that if they stick to that, if they really do raise the game, then that's respected in the planning system as well.
So the question in that connection, I mean, the government has quite ambitious aims on house building. And I think most people probably do now acknowledge the need for this. And it's been a kind of successful campaign to build recognition of the acute shortage of housing that we face in this country, and of the great cost that that shortage has. But there's obviously also, lots of concern that this house building poses a threat to other things that that we value, like green belts to protect our countryside. Do you think this is an argument for making more efficient use of the urban space that we already have through steps like gentle intensification around high streets or town centres or stations?
Yes, I think it has to be, doesn't it? I mean, you can't say that there is a severe shortage of housing in a country like the UK and just not respond to that. So we need to bring forward land for development, but understandably, people want to protect the countryside and green spaces of all kinds. but particularly those which we've protected in this country, like the Greenbelt, we don't want to see development on those sites. Therefore, we have to look at existing urban communities first and see what can we do to develop brownfield sites, to gently densify in those communities, and to support regeneration. In a sense, we've been presented with a once-in-a-generation opportunity by the fact that our high streets and some of our town and city centres are going through the biggest change, not just in our lifetimes, but probably at least since the Second World War. And so that gives us something that we should be responding to. It may be that COVID also presents further opportunities if there's less demand for city centre offices and so on, and that there may be further changes there that we can respond to. So I think we have to look in those places first. The work that you've done, Samuel, Policy Exchange, Sir Roger Scruton and the Commission did as well, I think is entirely in the right direction, that we should be trying to find humane ways of providing further density in those communities. That doesn't necessarily mean building tall, high-rise buildings which are entirely out of character with the look and the feel of particularly the suburbs of cities. That creates a lot of contention. I completely understand that. I'm not against high-rise buildings per se, but try to build them in places where they're more natural, where there are existing clusters of them. But I think there are ways in which we can be building above shops, we can be gently densifying, we can be taking the suburbs and modernizing them. And the many artists' impressions that you've helped to create, and there was one at the introduction to this talk, which I've seen before, those must point in the right direction as to how we can achieve this, building more homes in existing urban areas, therefore protecting the countryside and the protected places. It's also, incidentally, by far the most sustainable way to proceed. We want to be building communities that are walkable, livable, trying to recycle existing buildings wherever we can do. So everything points in the same direction, that we should be trying to do that. And that's been the focus of a lot of the reforms that we've been trying to do in recent years, to have very flexible rules to enable a cafe to be turned into a shop, into a yoga studio, into an office, and if not that, into a home, or to build upwards and so on. And so I think that level of fluidity and flexibility has to be part of the future of town and city centres. The other thing I think COVID has demonstrated is the need for mixed use communities. The places that have felt most moribund in the last 12 months have been those which are exclusively one thing, particularly exclusively offices. And that's a real problem in some parts of this country, and I'm sure it's the same in other countries as well. The City of London, for example, Canary Wharf, city centres in
eerie silence.
Yeah, and so I think that both we as citizens and also probably investors and developers will want to look to create settlements in the future which are much more resilient than that and have a good mix of homes, workspaces, retail, so that they can cope with whatever the future might throw at them.
The question about high streets is obviously one that many people are anxious about at the moment. There's been a longer term decline in footfall on high streets, which has been at least temporarily greatly accelerated by COVID-19 and the lockdowns. Obviously, the government can't abolish online shopping or order people to visit their corner shop a certain number of times per week, but nonetheless, people do feel, that the existence of a high street is not only a benefit in terms of the things that they can buy there, but a benefit in terms of the life it brings to a community and the way it brings people together and the sense of place that it creates. So what steps do you think the government can take to try to reinforce or try to sustain some of these places in these quite difficult times?
Well, I think that although we are undoubtedly all shopping more online than ever before, and the UK is actually now one of the leading countries in the world for our appetite to shop online, I wouldn't write off physical shopping and retail. Actually, a recent survey that I saw showed that now the number one thing that people look for in a neighborhood is access to good local shopping. So people still care about it. They might not be using it as much as they used to, but they do care about it. But we, as you say, COVID-19 has amplified and accelerated market forces that already existed beforehand and are posing a big challenge to the high street. You don't need to go to a high street these days very often at all. So we have to make sure that high streets are places people want to go to, that they are attractive, enticing places. That makes the agenda around quality and design and beauty and the public realm even more important than ever. Those high streets which are pleasant, charming, beautiful places are going to fare better than those that aren't. And I think that, again, they're going to have to be mixed uses. They're going to have leisure, heritage, workspaces, and homes all together in harmony. And we've tried to do that through some of the reforms that we've been doing alongside the Building Better Beautiful Commission. Sometimes there is a conflict between the two because creating a sufficiently free market response to meet the challenges at the moment, to give as much flexibility to small business owners or small builders who might be the ones who take that empty shop and turn it into a home, can sometimes be viewed as not providing sufficient protections for the look and the feel of those developments. And so there's a balancing act to be struck there. But I think we have to create a very flexible approach so that you can enable people to make the best possible use of those premises and to bring as much life and vitality into those communities as we possibly can.
Well, I know Sir Roger, he did guiltily admit to me in the last year that he produced a biography of Ted Hughes, and he said, "I'm afraid I did get this through Amazon." And I just, where would I have found this in a shop? Amazon does have its uses, but on the other hand, he'd always also say, "I belong basically in a cafe. That is my natural, the French philosopher's natural location," in which Roger saw himself is there on the high street in a cafe with sort of people coming up to talk to him on the.
So, well, the two sort of scenes that we'll remember of the high street of the last 12 months, one will be a negative one of it looking desolate and empty shops and so on. The other will be here in the UK, al fresco dining, people suddenly on a beautiful like the one we're on today. We have today people sitting out on chairs and tables, eating outside. So it's shown both the challenges facing the high street and also how much people want to get out and enjoy meeting together, human interaction, a beautiful environment.
One final question, more technical question on coding. This is one of the core ideas that the government has, is a shift towards this. The difference for the benefit of the larger audience, you can have design guides or you can have design codes. Design guide, there's a continuum between them, but a design guide will tend to be written in more kind of language that's more open to interpretation. So it will set kind of aspirations or the kinds of values that people want to see in buildings, and then that's interpreted in a discretionary way by planners, whereas codes are typically more visual and have more specific kinds of instructions in them. And the idea is that you can be pretty confident that you comply with a code, whereas with a guide, will always be more open to interpretation. I wonder if you could just comment generally for us, what's the big benefit of codes? What's, why should we be, and obviously Roger himself, was a big advocate of codes. So it's a question, ask the question in a friendly way, but why should we be, focusing on this shift from guidance towards coding in that way? And how does that feed into the Building Beautiful project?
Well, I think, codes, of course, have a long history, and they've helped to produce some of our most popular and enduring communities, whether that's Belgravia or Bath and Bourneville, places that have stood the test of time. Their strength comes from their simplicity. I think that you have a much greater sense that this is going to achieve the result that you want. With that comes restriction, obviously, and lack of flexibility, and that's the balancing act that different councils and communities will need to weigh up. But it is a way of ensuring that you get the result that you want, and I think it's a way of creating a very simple process for the participants in this on the other side. So if you're a small builder, local entrepreneur, homeowner, if you're someone who wants to do something, extend your home, build some new elements, fix up the high street, whatever it happens to be, you know what the rules are. They're relatively straightforward. You can go out and achieve that. And as long as you stick to those rules, hopefully you'll get a fair hearing from the planning system and the local community. And hopefully the result will be pretty good. And that, I think, is very appealing in many respects. And one of the challenges that we have in our house building sector here in the UK is that so much rests on such a small group of large volume house builders. I would like to see a much more diverse and competitive market where there are more entrants coming in. The issue there, amongst others, is how complex and expensive the system is to navigate.
Right.
You can produce something which is relatively straightforward, and that you get that fair hearing from the planning system, that if you stick to the rules that the local community have set out, then I think you could find that we get a more competitive industry, more people coming into it, and the results still being pretty good for people.
And indeed, more competition might drive up.
That will be a virtuous cycle, because that will drive up standards. Exactly. I don't think codes will work everywhere. Clearly, I don't think as Secretary of State we can create a single code for the whole country, but I really do see great value in them and want to encourage them in more parts of the country.
So we have huge numbers of questions streaming in from the audience. What should we go with? Harry Rushworth asks, the increased housing targets for London, if maintained, will mean many more homes approved under the tilted balance set by national policy, overriding local policies, unless local authorities themselves set out how many homes can be built in their areas. Does Sir Roger have anything to teach us about how to do that?
Well, I think he, without using his name in vain, I think he would certainly, what would he have steered us towards? It would have been towards the gentle densification, I'm sure. I think he probably would have believed that you could do things which are in keeping with the tradition, say, of the suburbs of London, using the same styles. You could create humane, attractive environments which didn't have to just be skyscrapers and tall buildings imposed upon communities. So I think that his legacy does point us in a certain direction there. He also admired some of the great regeneration projects. I mean, King's Cross, for example, I think he felt was one of the more successful ones in recent years. And I would certainly like to see more developments like that created. London is actually still a city with quite a large amount of brownfield land, particularly in East London. And so there will be opportunities in places like that to do really well-designed, well-planned regeneration schemes, which have a nod to the architectural heritage of the past, but still manage to deliver housing. I'm sure he would have parted company with the government on some things. I suspect he wouldn't have liked some of the high-rise buildings that are going up in some parts of London today. My approach to those, as I say, has been to try to give more power to the local community to determine where they're sited and to steer them towards the places where it's most environmentally sustainable, such as around existing transport infrastructure, and where there are existing clusters of high-rise buildings. So if Nine Elms now has many high-rise buildings, or Canary Wharf has many high-rise buildings, they're logical places to keep going. If you're in otherwise low-rise parts of the city, in outer London, for example, let's try to, where we can, to preserve that character.
Yes, I think Yeah, I know. Roger was definitely skeptical about a lot of high-rise, although he did praise some. He loved classic New York high-rise, and I think there were a few recent towers in New York that have emulated some of that, and that he was very impressed by. So it might be that he had yeah, I don't know. You could never quite predict what Roger was going to say. That was one of the things that made it so interesting to remained unpredictable. We've got a lot of questions about high-rise here. Matthew Montague Pollock asks, the Create Streets has a long-standing beef with tall buildings. The battle has been more or less lost in London, but provincial historic cities like my own, Bristol, are still threatened. If we want to save our city, we cannot rely on the word beauty, nor on the mayor's councillors, because the mayor has power over the supplementary planning document. But ordinary people in Bristol do not like tall buildings. How, in practical terms, could they stop them? How could they be connected to decisions the city makes on major developments? How can Bristol councillors be encouraged to listen to ordinary people? That's a contentious question for you. But
yes, well, as I say, my approach has been to try to give control to the local community through its local council to create a tall buildings policy where they can determine, do they like them at all? And if they are willing to have them, then to site them in particular places that work for them and are in some sense coherent. That does rely on your local council making good decisions. And you may, can't comment on Bristol, you may or may not conclude that, you know, your local council is going to make a wise choice as to where to site taller buildings. But I think that's probably the right way forward, that we don't have, you know, I don't think you can have a national prohibition, but I think you want to give the local council the ability to say that if we are going to have taller buildings, these are the parts of the city that we think they should be sited in. I do want to preserve great views within cities. There was a particular case recently in Norwich, for example, where I used my power as Secretary of State to oppose the building of a high-rise building there, which I thought would have a detrimental impact on heritage and the historic setting of the cathedral and other historic buildings. So that's something that I've taken a personal interest in, and I think some of our cathedral cities and towns, for example, are absolute jewels. They're things that really define us as a country, and I'd like to see them preserved. So I think it's being clear about where is the right place to site high-rise buildings. Of course, if you don't want to have high-rise buildings and you still want to build homes, then there will be other consequences, won't there? And so if you want to protect the green belt and the countryside, and you don't want to have high-rise buildings, then I think you do need to be really imaginative about brownfield sites, the high street, gentle density, the agenda that Roger and Policy Exchange and others have been so good at furthering. You can't have it all, you know, both ways. It's a perfectly sensible and something I would agree with, that you might choose not to have high rise and you might choose to protect the countryside. That's many people's ideal. But then what we really need to do is be bold on reimagining other places.
Yeah, no, I often I've often returned to, there are trade-offs here. The country does need more homes, and we need to, if we want to reject some of these ways that don't, you know, are indeed often unpopular, and then we have to think quite creatively about alternatives.
Yeah, that's right. But as I say, the good news is that the market forces that we're seeing, the huge challenge to the high street, the potential of people not returning to offices in the same way, does give us a route into achieving that in a way that perhaps one wouldn't have been able to do 10 or 20 years ago. And so now is the moment to build those homes by gently densifying, by reimagining town and city centres.
We have a question in this vein from Robert Adam, who was an earlier guest on this series and has been a frequent interlocutor in the Q&As. Asks, Secretary of State, the work on the National Model Design Code is pioneering, possibly internationally, in that it increases democracy in an otherwise bureaucratic planning process by giving the community the ability to define what is beautiful to them and the place and their place and put that in, and place that into the planning system. Policy Exchange has proposed a street-scale democratic system, strong suburbs, that seems to be a natural extension of this. This could be a win-win with greater intensity and financial benefits to residents. What do you make of this? A flattering question from Robert there.
Well, I think at the time when that piece of work was published, I said it was a very interesting one. I think we have to work through how practical it is to be able to create your own design guides and codes for a particular street or the square that you live in. But I'm very interested in that as an idea. I know that there's been a suggestion that you could excite your neighbours by the prospect of adding to your house prices by everybody building upwards or extended in particular ways. It's difficult to know whether that would happen in practice. But I think the most compelling thing of all is just giving a local community the ability to determine what their own area should look like, how it should evolve and adapt in the years ahead. And if there's a way of distilling downwards from the local authority to a neighbourhood to a smaller unit, which is even more human in scale, then I think we should try to pursue that. And I think there probably are ways in which we could do that, which Robert and others have suggested.
We have a question from Eleanor Parker, asks, my local council, which I think will remain nameless, seems determined to foist horrible new buildings upon us and has dismissed its heritage officer. I go to planning consultations, but they seem to have no effect on the developers. What more can we do?
Well, this is exactly why we're having this conversation, isn't it? Right. We are trying to raise the standards, and we're trying to ensure that communities have an ability to reject ugliness and poor quality design. The tools that we've developed are obviously the changes to the planning system itself through the amendments to the national policy framework, and this use of and reliance on design codes and guides. I think overall that will raise standards. It does place a lot of emphasis on local councils though. And so there's a big cultural change that we need to go through, where we help local councils to prepare all of those documents, to make them genuinely visionary and imaginative, genuinely responsive to local people's views. As I said earlier, there's no point them just appointing a consultancy to come in and produce something that doesn't really engage local people or reflect their views. So that's something that we need to get right. Hopefully Nicholas and the team of the Office for Place will help us to do that. And we need local people to hold them to account, to care about this and to be raising it with their local councillors, to be voting out councillors that don't care about this agenda or are not responsible for producing really good design codes and for taking this seriously with design.
Question from Will Ing. How are you going to ensure that young people's voices are heard in the formation of design codes? Do you agree that this is important?
I do. I think young people are generally neglected by the planning system. Certainly people who aren't homeowners are rarely active participants in planning decisions or in plan making, and the same is probably true for design codes and guides. So we need to try and ensure that young people's voices are heard. One of the objectives of the Office for Place is to think about how do you actually engage with local communities in a meaningful way? How can you use more accessible ways of meeting people who are younger, people of working age, people who may not go to the community centre or the village hall to see presentations on a wet Wednesday evening, but who would be very engaged by perhaps events like this, online, things you can get on your smartphone. How can you actually engage? How can you use polling, which Nicholas and Create Streets have been very good at, thinking about other ways in which you can get a sense of what local people's views really are. So we're thinking through what the toolkit is there to ensure that local people's views are properly represented, and that it's the complete spectrum of people of all ages. And as I say, listening to those people who are not yet on the housing ladder, as well as those who are and clearly have a big stake in the future of their communities.
Andrew Pearson asks, the Midlands used to be a manufacturing powerhouse, but has been held back for decades by successive governments, in particular through restrictions on building offices and homes. Do you support giving local areas more powers to allow more housing where they see fit?
Well, yes, I do want to see more housing, and I do want to see local areas making those choices. I mean, actually, I'm not sure I entirely agree with the premise of that question, because it varies, of course, but some parts of the Midlands have very strong records of house building today. I mean, the West Midlands, for example, is one of the parts of the country that has the best record in the last 5 years in building homes. It's also generally been good at doing them on brownfield sites, actually, rather than on greenfield and the countryside, because there's still quite a large amount of brownfield in both the West and the East Midlands, but particularly in the Black Country and some of the areas around Birmingham. So there's a lot of opportunity there to build on the sorts of sites that we all want to see being built on as a priority. The broader planning reforms that we're taking forward place a great emphasis on local areas producing a really strong plan. And we want to return to plan making as something that is map-based, easy to understand, highly engaging, is relatively quick to produce. So a couple of years, and that's still a long time by most people's standards, but it's not the 7 years that it takes on average today. Has the information that it needs within it to maintain standards and to answer the questions, but is not so lengthy and incomprehensible that it would take a true expert to really understand and engage with it, and to view that as a way to making the process better and faster and getting more homes built.
David Bell asks, working from home seems here to stay. Do you see this as providing opportunities for the revitalization of local shops, catering, eating places, and so on?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think today you see that the suburbs seem to have had a revival because people are working from home more, are out there enjoying local shops and cafes and restaurants and so on. Hopefully, as we go through our roadmap here and reopen, you'll see more of that. There seems to be a lot of interest now in buying homes and building homes in the suburbs, almost recapturing their original spirit in, when they began in Victorian Edwardian times, becoming much more, hopefully more vibrant places. So I think that's all extremely positive. Of course, the quid pro quo for that is that some of our inner cities are facing a more challenging period at the moment, as they have fewer office workers, international tourists and students. We don't yet know, I think, how that will shake out, and we'll have to wait and see, really. Probably later this year in the autumn, we'll get a better sense of what is cyclical and what is actually long-term systemic change. But my own instinct is that hundreds of years of urbanism will not be undone by the events of the last 12 months, and that people are essentially social animals. We do want to go out and see our friends and family. We do find it more interesting and exciting to go into the office, because that's where creativity comes from, by being around each other. And I think you lose a lot in terms of learning and mentoring and culture in not being in the office. So if I had to guess, I would say that we will undoubtedly move into an era where hybrid working is much more prevalent, but not one where we give up on coming into the office altogether. And so the new normal, whenever that takes form, will be one where we'll be in the office 3 or 4 days a week, but perhaps having the opportunity to work from home some of the week.
As so often, the new normal will be a mixture of the old normal and some fresh elements. We've got almost out of time, but one final overall question. When you move on to greater things, will you be happy for your success as Secretary of State to be measured on what progress we have made in creating more homes, while making the country more beautiful?
Well, I would love to think that's the case. There's all sorts of quotes along those lines, aren't there, of people saying that the legacy of a housing secretary are the buildings that were built in their tenure. Of course, that's not entirely true, because the legacy of a housing secretary is what's built in the years to come after you leave.
Right.
Because it takes the buildings that are being built today were built under the tenure of somebody who sat in this chair several years ago. But yeah, I would like to think that we could embed beauty and quality and design into the planning system, that it becomes a fixture, a permanent fixture of the planning system, and something that ultimately then drives up standards significantly, and that we could see a real change in the types of homes and communities and neighborhoods that are built in this country for many years to come. And in doing so, we could try to answer the question whether supply of homes needs to always be in conflict with beauty and quality, which is the way that the debate really has been framed in recent years, so that it's very difficult to be seen to be a champion of both. You're either a vandal who wants to build more homes, albeit well-intentioned, because you want to help people onto the housing ladder, or you're a NIMBY who wants to stop those young people and people on low incomes getting onto the housing ladder, but you want to preserve beauty and the environment and heritage. If we can find a harmony or a degree of harmony between those two forces, then I think we will have done something that's very valuable.
After all, our beautiful cities must have been built somehow.
That's right.
Well, we've got dozens more questions, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint those who've asked them on this occasion and wrap things up. I just want to thank you very much once again, Robert, for a fascinating conversation, and wish you luck in the continuing work of the government.
Thank you. Been lovely to be here.
Well, thank you again, Robert. It's not lost on This American how great of an honor it is to have you join us in general for an interview, but nonetheless, the end of this series, Building Beautiful. And thank you to you, Samuel, for the great job you did today, as well as throughout this whole series. I think it's been a major success and one of at least the first defining features of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation that we need to explore the topic across the board and internationally at that. So thank you again to you both.